Hi, everybody. My name is Shannon, and I'm a research assistant with the NSRLP. And today I'm going to be talking about the accommodations process. So before we begin, I'll tell you a little bit about myself. I am a law student, and I've been a research assistant with the NSRLP for over a year. And one of the major projects that I've had the opportunity to help out with was conducting a study based on barriers to justice and accommodation faced by cognitively disabled self-represented litigants. And in pursuit of this study, I got to do a lot of research on accommodations and also a lot of research into the barriers to accommodations that self-represented litigants face. So today I'll be giving an overview of the accommodation system. I'll be talking about what accommodations are and how people usually seek them. And then I'll move into discussing some of the common barriers to accommodation that we found in our study. And I'll conclude with suggesting some of the ways that SRLs can sort of get around these common barriers. So to begin, what is an accommodation? As stated in the Canadian Human Rights Act, disabled people should have access to equal opportunities and can't be legally discriminated against for having a disability. And under the Act, disability is very broadly defined. Legally, disability can include physical impairments and also potentially the experience of being perceived as disabled, which includes negative or invalidating stereotypes. And invisible stereotypes like intellectual or cognitive impairments are also protected against discrimination. The Human Rights Act is a federal statute, which means that it applies across Canada. So wherever you are in Canada, wherever you live, you should have access to some accommodation for your disability. In other words, every courthouse across Canada should have accommodations in place for both physical and cognitive or intellectual disabilities. More to the point, the Supreme Court of Canada has stated that reasonable accommodations for people with disabilities or people with intellectual disabilities is a recognition of their equality rights. So that is, individuals affected by disabilities must have the same rights and the same ability to access the same processes in society as those without disabilities. In the court context, accommodations are adjustments to regular court procedures made to accommodate someone with a disability. In other words, the court should make changes or modifications that help someone who would otherwise be unable to do something because of their disability. For physical disabilities, common accommodations include wheelchair ramps, elevators, sort of other accommodations that relate to mobility or physical accessibility. It can also include ASL or interpretation services, listening devices, etc. And for people with cognitive disabilities, accommodations are usually aimed at helping someone communicate effectively. They provide written materials, for example, in more easily read or understood ways. It's allowing for slower proceedings and more repetition, preparing for additional time of the proceedings, or even allowing the presence of a Mackenzie friend or another support person. Because disability is so broadly defined, typical accommodations might not adequately address individual people's needs. It might not adequately address individual people's barriers to participation. So there are also kind of general guiding principles for the application of accommodations. Generally, courts, lawyers, legal professionals, etc., they're required to remove discriminatory barriers for the sake of accessibility. And the goal is to maintain people's dignity and their individuality while also helping that person fully participate in legal proceedings. And that can look a lot of different ways. It sort of demands flexibility from the legal system. So, for example, we've spoken with an SRL who was allowed to wear sunglasses in court because of her debilitating migraines. And this isn't a standard accommodation, but it is in line with the goal of accommodation that we just mentioned, which is to enable people to participate fully regardless of their disability. However, as I'll explain later, this kind of ideal system where unique disabilities are accommodated in novel ways, unfortunately, doesn't play out the way we would hope that it would. So the general procedure to request an accommodation varies across Canada because different courthouses across Canada do have different procedures set up. And these procedures also differ by province, by region, by the level of court that you're at. So unfortunately, there isn't really a one size fits all kind of process. If you require an accommodation, you'll have to do some research based on your specific courthouse to see what the required process is. Generally, the process involves contacting a specific individual or a specific office at your court by email or potentially by mail, where you submit a request for accommodation kind of to that person or to that address. In Ontario, for example, there's usually an accessibility coordinator appointed by the Ministry of the Attorney General. So you'd go to these accessibility coordinators with your questions, your request for your accommodation, and whatever else you need to help with things related to your disability. The process is typically similar across Canada, but different courts have different names for the position or person that you should contact. Different courts, of course, have different offices, different contact information. So a good first step is to visit the NSRLP's primer. It's called SRLs with Disabilities, List of Organizations and Services Who Can Help. This is a really good list of available resources for disabled SRLs, and it provides info about who to contact for accommodations inquiries wherever you are across Canada. Your accommodation requests are typically required to be submitted and processed prior to your day in court. So a lot of SRLs end up making requests directly to judges, so a verbal submission of their request. And this isn't actually the sort of correct thing to do. Judges aren't trained in accommodations, so they might not be qualified to get you the accommodation you need. And if you're making the request in court, it could be too late for them to apply certain accommodations. And if you're also making that accommodation request in court, there's also an opportunity for opposing counsel to object to your request. So remember that you need to submit your request to the right person with plenty of time before your day in court. Now, we've touched a little bit on sort of what the barriers are to requesting accommodation, and I'll elaborate on them now. So while there is a correct process, as we now know, there are a lot of barriers to actually making this process work for people. And candidly, there are a lot of barriers for disabled SRLs when it comes to requesting accommodations. Firstly, a lot of courts don't make it easy to know who you should contact and when you should contact them and how you should contact them. The information available online in Ontario, for example, is super sparse and quite uninformative. And so that's another reason why the NSRLP primers are a good place to start, because it's kind of a centralized place for the information that removes some of the need for you to kind of go digging around. And another barrier is that judges are, like I mentioned, not really trained in accommodations. Because the information about the correct procedure for requesting accommodations is so inaccessible, a lot of SRLs do end up speaking to judges about their problem. That's kind of the intuitive place to go. And from an accessibility standpoint, it's unacceptable that someone would not get a necessary accommodation just because they didn't have anyone to help them through the formal process. And to this point, the NSRLP has actually advocated that judges and courthouse employees be better educated about disabilities and the available accommodations at their courthouses. Because at the very least, we hope that a judge, when kind of faced with a verbal request, would be able to direct SRLs to the right person or the right office. Generally, there are also barriers to courts and judges' understandings of disabilities. So something we saw a lot in our research was that the accommodation given to SRLs didn't necessarily get to the heart of their disability and the heart of the problem that they were facing. I mentioned the woman before who got to wear sunglasses during her proceedings. And that was an example of kind of a novel proceeding, or pardon me, a novel accommodation. It wasn't necessarily the most effective accommodation though, because at that time her migraine was so bad that it actually prevented her from properly participating in her proceedings. In that case, while it was a novel accommodation, a different accommodation or even an adjournment probably would have been more appropriate. So there are these barriers, but how do we get around them? How do we try to overcome them? Because courts and judges may know so little, or at least reveal so little about the proper accommodations process, it's necessary for people who need an accommodation to find out not only who to request their accommodation to, but also what accommodations they need by doing some research. And a good place to start for this is another NSRLP primer This one is called A Guide for SRLs with Disabilities, Understanding Your Rights and Requesting the Assistance You Need. It's a really good place to start, and it gives a more thorough overview of available accommodations. If you're able to request your specific accommodation to the right person ahead of time, it eliminates that situation that we've talked about where a judge ends up making up an accommodation on the spot. So, for example, if you struggle with migraines, you may need to tell the court well in advance that 1, you'll need to wear sunglasses. 2, you'll need to bring in a Mackenzie friend or a support person to help you with note-taking and clerical tasks. And 3, the court should prepare for slower proceedings. Generally, communicating with the appropriate officer at your court as early as possible is very important. And we really want to avoid that situation where you are just in front of a judge asking for a last minute sort of accommodation. It's not right that judges don't know what to do, and it's not your fault or any other SRL's fault that the court so often fails to provide these accommodations. And the NSRLP is advocating for a more flexible and helpful system that more gets to the spirit of the Human Rights Act in Canada. But for now, unfortunately, the current system kind of places that burden on SRLs. The system is flawed. So even if you follow the correct procedure to the letter, you still might not get the accommodation you need. But contacting the right person early on gives you the best chance of getting the accommodation you need. So now I'll just kind of quickly summarize what we've talked about. In summary, available accommodations are diverse and should be flexible to address a broad spectrum of disabilities. To find out who to contact about your request for accommodation, make sure to check out the NSRLP's primers and do some research into your province and your courthouse. It's also helpful to know what accommodations you want, to have a clear vision for what accommodations you need. And you can get an idea of what's typically available, what's typically done from other NSRLP primers, for example, the one cited above. And if you can, try to start the conversation about accommodation as early as possible, because last minute requests and requests made before judges are less likely to be helpful or even to be allowed. So you're less likely to get your accommodation that way. If you want to know more about the common barriers to accommodation faced by SRLs and what changes the NSRLP has recommended in the legal system to streamline the process, you can check out our report, Struggling for Accommodations, Barriers to Accessibility Faced by Cognitively Disabled SRLs, on our website. Thanks very much for listening. And you can see on the screen, all of our NSRLP contact info is there, as well as the website domain address. So definitely check out the materials I've mentioned. And thank you very much for your time.